Hello, everyone. So today we are going to be doing day 3 of the American Revolution. Our story today is mostly about the famous ride of Paul Revere. So let's get to our story and see what happens. A sleepless night before a revolution. What are you waiting for, Thomas Gage? That was basically the message from London. King George wanted action. He wanted General Gage to march his soldiers out of Boston and seize the military supplies that were being stored by local militias. He wanted patriot troublemakers like Samuel Adams and John Hancock arrested and shipped back to London in chains. Orders are orders. Tensions in Boston were at a record level in the spring of 1775. General Gage was so worried about another Boston Massacre type incident, he refused to allow his soldiers to carry their pistols in the streets. For this sound judgment, the soldiers called Gage the Old Woman. Meanwhile, in the towns around Boston, thousands of militia members were just waiting for the British soldiers to make a move. Some militias even called themselves Minutemen, because they could get all their stuff together in a matter of just a minute. Gage was sitting on a time bomb, and everyone could hear it ticking. But orders are orders. The general considered his options. He knew that the local militias were storing up weapons in Concord, a town just 17 miles north of Boston. And he knew that Samuel Adams and John Hancock were lying low in a house in Lexington. Interesting. So Gage came up with this plan. He sent 700 British soldiers to Lexington and Concord. They could try to grab Adams and Hancock in Lexington. Then they could march on to Concord and destroy the military supplies there. That should make the king happy, right?
Don't open that envelope. During the afternoon of April 18th, 1775, Gage sat at his desk and wrote out orders for the mission. He sealed the plan in an envelope without showing it to anyone. He gave the envelope to Colonel Francis Smith, who was the lead in the expedition. He told Smith to have his soldiers assemble on Boston Commons by the Charles River at exactly 10 o'clock that night. He ordered Smith not to open the envelope with the plan until then. Why would Gage keep the plan a secret from the men who was leading the mission? Gage knew that it was going to be very dangerous for his soldiers to march out into the hostile territory around Boston. His hope was to keep the march secret until the very last second. Then his soldiers just might be able to get out to Concord and back before the Minutemen had time to react.
Everyone's a spy. How did this happen? A story went around that Gage's wife, she was an American, had leaked the plan. But this was never more than just a rumor. The real problem, from Gage's point of view, was that almost everyone in Boston was a spy. Well, maybe not an official spy, but everyone in town was keeping an angry eye on those hated British soldiers. One of the men who organized this American spy ring was a silversmith named Paul Revere. The British couldn't make a move without everyone knowing about it. And by April 18th, it was really, really obvious that something was going on in Boston. British officers were stopping by the stables, making sure their horses were ready to go, totally ignoring the lowly local kids who worked as the stable boys. The officers bragged about the upcoming actions. The stable boys passed information on to Paul Revere. Another clue? The British repaired their small transport boats and launched them into the Charles River. These were the boats the British soldiers would use if they ever wanted to cross the river on their way to Lexington and Concord. As Revere noted, from those movements we expected something serious was about to transact. Trapped in Boston. So Revere and his fellow spies knew the British were about to do something very serious. But what? It really wasn't that hard to guess. Everyone knew about the weapons in Concord, and everyone knew that King George wanted them destroyed. Everyone also knew that the king wanted John Hancock and Samuel Adams arrested. British soldiers made no secret of their hostile feelings for Hancock and Adams. One popular British marching chant went like this. You can sing along to the tune of Yankee Doodle. As for the king, John Hancock and Adams, if they're taken, their heads for a sign shall hang on high upon the hill called Beacon. It doesn't exactly rhyme, but you get the point. Hancock and Adams were wanted men, and any time your head is hanging up on a sign, it's no good. On the night of April 18th, British soldiers were gathering by the river. Revere and his friends knew what they had to do. First, warn Hancock and Adams that British soldiers were on their way to arrest them. Second, alert the people of Concord that the British were coming to destroy the weapons stored there. That would be easier said than done, though. Boston was nearly surrounded by water, so to get out of the city, you had to either cross the Charles River or make it over the thin strip of land called Boston Neck. The guy who volunteered to hang the lanterns was a young sexton at Old North Church, Robert Newman. A sexton cleans up the place, rings the church bell, stuff like that. Newman didn't like the job, but he kept it. He said, because times are so hard. Now it was just before 10 o'clock and Newman was ready for action. The first thing he did was say goodnight to his mom. And not just because he was a good son, but because British officers were renting rooms in the family house. And at this moment, they were sitting around playing cards in the living room. Newman wanted the officers to think he was going to bed for the evening. In fact, he went up to his room, climbed out the window, climbed over the roof, and jumped down into the dark shadows in front of the church. Revere found Newman there at a little after 10 o'clock. Maybe Revere held up two fingers to silently show Newman that the British were moving out by water. This was clear by now, since the British soldiers were already gathering by the river. Newman knew what to do. He used his keys to unlock the church doors. He took two lanterns from the closet, climbed to the top of the bell tower, and lit the lanterns. But only for a moment. He didn't want the signal to be spotted by anyone on the warships, which was clearly visible from the water below. Then Newman went downstairs, put the lanterns back, leapt out of the window of the old church, climbed up over the roofs, up into his mother's house, dropped in through the window of his bedroom, and lay down in bed. You think he slept that night? Across the river. As soon as Paul Revere left Robert Newman at the church, he ran home to get his riding boots. Revere's mission was to row across the Charles River, if possible, and then ride out to Lexington with the warning. By now, the streets were filled with British soldiers armed for battle, marching towards their meeting point at the river. Avoiding the soldiers, Revere hustled from his house down to a spot on the water where he had a small rowboat hidden. Two friends were waiting for Revere by the boat. They had agreed to row him across the river, but now that Revere and his friends looked out at the Charles, they realized that they had a problem. The warship, with its 64 guns, was sitting out there, keeping watch over the water. In just Revere's luck, it was a clear night with a big, bright moon. To have a chance, they would have to be absolutely silent. Have you ever been in a rowboat? They make a lot of noise. The oars are held in place by old metal oarlocks, which clink and squeak as the oars are pulled. To muffle the sound, Revere would need some cloth to wrap around the oarlocks. No one had thought of this ahead of time. Luckily, one of Revere's friends had a girlfriend who lived on a nearby street. They rushed to her house. The guy gave a whistle outside his girlfriend's window. She came to the window. He whispered for her to throw down some cloth. She quickly slipped off her flannel petticoat, a kind of slip worn under a dress, and tossed it down. Revere and his friends ripped it apart as fast as they could and wrapped it around the oarlocks. Revere and that other guy. A few pals were waiting for Revere on the Charleston River. They told him that they had seen the lanterns just fine and had already started spreading the news. They warned him that British officers were out patrolling the roads. Then they gave him a fast horse and would watch him set off on his most famous horseback ride in all of American history. It was then about 11 o'clock, Revere remembered. We know that Revere's first goal was to get to Lexington to warn Adams and Hancock. On the way there, he warned people in houses along the road. Most people think that Revere shouted, "The British are coming! The British are coming!" But what he probably said was, "The regulars are out! The regulars are out!" By regulars, he meant British soldiers. He really should have said, "The British are coming!" It sounds better. Oh well, too late now. Paul Revere gets all the press, but meanwhile, a second express rider was also out that night. He was a 23-year-old shoemaker named Billy Dawes. This was another part of Revere's backup plan. If he could not get out, or if he got caught, maybe Dawes would be able to warn the other people. To get out of Boston, Dawes first had to find a way past the British soldiers guarding Boston Neck. He was the perfect man for this risky job. He was the kind of guy who liked to sneak in and out of Boston pretending to be a drunken farmer just for laughs. So he made it out. He set out for Lexington. Where are the British? Where are the British? Gage's whole plan was based on timing. He wanted his soldiers to hit Concord before dawn, before the Minutemen had a chance to gather their large numbers. Gage's first mistake was putting Colonel Francis Smith in charge of the expedition. Smith was a slow-moving man, one of those people who was always late. You'll remember that Gage ordered Smith to have his soldiers assembled by the boats at exactly 10 o'clock? Well, the men were there, but Smith wasn't. When he finally showed up, about 700 soldiers were standing around wondering what they were supposed to be doing. From this point on, everything moved much too slowly. It took 2 trips to get all the soldiers across the Charles River. Once they were on the other side, the men stood around waiting. More. Lieutenant John Barker remembered, "We were halted in a dirty road and stood there till 2 o'clock in the morning, waiting for provisions to be brought back from the other side by the boats." This was a total waste of time, since most of the men had brought their own food. As soon as they got their share of food, they threw it on the ground. So 4 hours were already gone, and the British had traveled about a quarter of a mile. Not a good start. At least they were on their way now, marching towards Lexington in the bright moonlight. On to Concord. And speaking of Lexington, Billy Dawes arrived at the Clark's house while we were checking on the British. Don't blame him for getting there half an hour after Revere. His route was longer. While Dawes and Revere had a quick snack, you have to eat, even in the middle of a famous historical event, Captain John Parker got the Lexington Minutemen together in the center of town. They had their guns. They were ready to defend their town. The only problem was, there was nothing to do. The British were nowhere in sight. It was a cold night. Parker couldn't keep his men standing out there forever, so he let the men go, but told them to listen for William Diamond beating his drum. This was the signal for the Minutemen to come running back to Lexington Common. Some of the men went home, others walked across the common to Buckman's Tavern, where they had a drink and waited by the warm fire. At about 1 a.m., Revere and Dawes left the Clark's house. Riding on very tired horses, they started down the road toward Concord. They still had to warn the people there that, well, you know what? On their way out of Lexington, they met up with Samuel Prescott, a young doctor from Concord. Prescott was heading home from his fiancée Linda's house. He offered to help spread the alarm with Revere and Dawes. The 3 of them set off together. Now remember those armed British soldiers that General Gage sent out to patrol the roads? They're about to make a sudden appearance. Captured. On the way to Concord, Prescott and Dawes stopped to warn people in a house beside the road. Revere rode up ahead a bit just to check out the path. He spotted 2 British officers hiding in the shadows of a tree. They spotted him too. Then a lot of things happened very quickly. Revere shouted a warning to Prescott and Dawes. A few more British officers charged out from the shadows, pointing their pistols and shouting, "If you go an inch further, you're a dead man." This didn't stop anyone. Revere, Prescott, and Dawes all dashed off in different directions. Prescott jumped his horse over an old stone wall and raced down the road. Dawes tried to trick the British by pretending to be one of them. He scrambled to his feet and darted into the dark woods on foot. Revere also raced his horse towards the woods, but he rode right to a spot where 6 more British officers were hiding. They stepped out of the shadows, held their guns on Revere, and questioned him. These guys knew who Paul Revere was, and they had a good idea of what he was doing. Revere never forgot what happened next. One of them clapped his pistol to my head, called me by my name, and told me he was going to ask me some questions. And if I did not give him the true answers, he would shoot me. Revere admitted that he had been out warning people that night that the British Army was on its way. The British cursed at him and kept threatening to shoot him, but they had to patrol the roads, and they didn't want to worry about keeping an eye on him. So they took his horse and let him go. Revere stumbled through pastures and graveyards on his way back to Lexington. Meanwhile, Dawes was somewhere in the woods without a horse. If anyone was going to get to Concord in time to warn the town, it would have to be Prescott. Beat the drum, Billy. Now it was a few minutes after 4 a.m. You know that cold, gray light that comes just before sunrise? That's how it was in Lexington when the British Army was finally spotted on the roadside. They were a mile away and coming on fast. Captain Parker told 16-year-old William Diamond to start beating his drum. The Lexington Minutemen grabbed their guns and ran into town. So that's where our story ends today, guys, with Paul Revere sending out a warning with Prescott and Dawes to Lexington and to Concord, saying that the British were on their way. We'll pick up tomorrow as the British are finally arriving in Lexington after their very slow start. I'm excited to see where our story takes us tomorrow.